Okay, so this is my response to topics two, um, the question of the album becoming back in fashion, so to speak. So I think that that's interesting, and I think that it's interesting from a couple of different perspectives. So first of all, I think it's interesting that you're talking about it from a hip hop perspective because I think that uh, where you are seeing it more so, and I think we'll continue to see it, is in the hip hop realm. And I'll talk about in a moment why that is. And the second thing is that I don't think that an album, people are making albums because they are necessary, but I think that people are making albums now to make an artistic statement. So I'll talk about that first, and then I'll talk about the hip hop thing. So I think that what I find fascinating is there's really not a need for people to release albums today. And in fact, I was at Hold Steady um, meet and greet, sound check sort of deal where they had a Q&A and somebody asked about how they're releasing music, and they talked about how they're releasing singles now. They're basically this year they've released I think six, maybe not six, maybe four two-sided singles. So a total of 8 songs, um, but two sides to each single. And they talked about how like that's a much better way to make music nowadays, and how it used to be that like if you wanted to put out a record, it was assumed, especially for somebody like them, that you're going to put out a vinyl. If you're going to put out a vinyl, that means you takes quite a bit of time after the songs been mixed and produced, or produced and mixed, I guess, um, before you're able to actually get the product out in the market. And they said the great thing about doing these singles is they produce and mix the song, and then within 24 hours, literally within 24 hours, the song is released on social media, or not social media, but the different music platforms. So it's not necessary, right? Nobody needs to make an album. So people that are making albums because they must have a reason behind it. And I think that that reason is that it's an artistic statement now for artists. Um, I think that many artists, and I'm checking my notes here because I wanted to make sure I had a lot of thoughts on this, so I wanted to make sure I wrote some notes. But I think that artists now, and true, like when I say artists, I mean people that view themselves as artists. And I suppose even the most poppiest of bands probably view themselves as artists, but I think you and I both know what we're talking about when we talk about artists. And I think that artists, if they want to make an artistic statement, they make that statement with an album. Or musician artists, if they want to make a statement, they make that statement with an album. I think the Hold Steady are making singles because they don't have a statement that they want to make. They want to put out a bunch of songs, that they like, but they don't want to have to worry about. And I know that Craig Finn and the Hold Steady, they're the sort of people that are going to think about. Um, they're going to think about the album and what the album is saying, and the narrative behind the album. So the other thing that I think is going on is I think that where you're seeing the album become more important, or sort of have this resurgence, is in hip hop. And I think it's happening in hip hop for a few reasons, but I think that hip hop right now lends itself really well to it. And part of it is some of the sort of I don't want to call them tropes, but some of the sort of traditional things about hip hop. So, for instance, artists have to have a come up story, right? And, Damn was Kendrick's come up story, right? And most artists, Kendrick waited until his third album before it was his third album, right? His third official album, sixth or so other album. But anyways, it took Kendrick, it took him a while to come out with it, but most people, do it in their first album. And so when, the way that hip hop sort of is structured is you release these mixtapes, and these mixtapes are sort of your collections of songs, but your mixtapes, except for the really good mixtapes, that we all know and love, right? With exception of those good mixtapes, like for the most part, a mixtape is just for a way for a hip hop artist to release a bunch of songs. But when they come out with their first album, that's a statement, and it's known as a statement that they're making, with that album, right? I think part of it is, the intro come up story. Part of it is that, how the structure of how hip hop artists sort of make it into the mainstream. I think the other part of it is, hip hop continues uh, to fight for artistic relevance. And, it's unfortunate that hip hop still has to do that today, but I think it still does fight for artistic relevance. I don't think you have to fight for artistic relevance if you are um, the hold steady. If you're a bunch of white dudes that play guitars and somebody beats on drums, you don't have to fight for relevance. Or fight for artistic relevance. Whereas I think hip hop today is still fighting for artistic relevance. So I wanted to talk about, that being said, where I saw some good albums. You asked for some non-hip hop, and so where I saw some good albums um, this year. And so you also asked specifically about Travis Scott and Drake, and I suppose I should comment on those specific albums. So I had listened to the Drake album. Eh, I like Drake. I like his emo. I like his, whatever. I'm sort of on the, not sort of, I'm definitely on the Pusha T side with this Pusha Drake beef. But, I like Drake, but that album is just bland to me. It's just bland. It doesn't have the same feeling that he used to have, I think. And maybe it's too polished. Maybe it's too produced. I don't know. That Travis Scott album is good. I actually hadn't listened to it until you suggested I listen to it, and I'll talk about that in a moment when I get into what my second or my throwback to you is. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you a few albums that I think are they're 2018 albums, and they're representative of albums that are albums for album's sake. The first one that I want to talk about is Car Seat Headrest, and their album Twin Dream. It is definitely an album. There's a narrative, there's a perspective, there's a story that flows through the album. It's about dealing with not just mental illness and love, but dealing with the combination of mental illness and love. It throughout the album, there's a constant theme and a constant narrative of sort of Will sort of fighting with this battle between love and his mental health. And then at the same time, there's also an internal narrative about fighting with this album. This album is actually a redo of a previous album called Twin Fantasy that was super popular on Bandcamp, and lots of people loved it. And he redid the album, and it's about this battle and creating this album as well. And so there's a narrative there. Another couple albums. The Middle Kids have a narrative and a flow to their album. There's a beginning and an end. There's a story that is told throughout the album. Jeff Rosenstock is probably one of the best post Donald Trump albums out there. It's called Post, and it's really dealing with post Donald Trump America and what it's like to live in a post Donald Trump America. Lucy Dacus and Soccer Mommy, both I grouped them together because they're both artistic statements. So there's not necessarily a narrative to the albums, but they are artistic statements. They are presenting themselves with these albums. That is the purpose of those albums. And then, of course, Father John Misty makes albums. Every album that Father John Misty makes has a perspective or a narrative that it's trying to follow. But there's if not a story, there is each album definitely has its own perspective. And I'm not as familiar with the most recent album. I haven't listened to it as much, but I know that it also has a perspective to it. All this being said, I have been distracted lately. because I've had some amazing concerts. I am on a streak, a run, to get 50 shows in this year. And I've had the Hold Steady. I've got Pearl Jam coming up, and I've had a few other big shows, Car Seat Headrest for one, that I'd been looking forward to, and so I'd been prepping for those shows and listening to that music, and I haven't over the past probably 2 months really listened to too much new music, and it really started when I went on a vacation for the first time. Um, that's when I think I stopped listening to as much new music. So I'm a little bit behind over the past 2 months, but it's because of live music. And so um, I wanted to throw a couple things back to you. So the first one is, in regard to the album concept, what do you think about my notion of hip hop being right now just a fertile ground because of some structural as well as some institutional characteristics of hip hop that cause that to sort of rely on the album more so today than they have in the past? So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And then I would also love to get your thoughts on stadium live music. So I'm going to see Pearl Jam, and they're playing at Wrigley Field. They're doing a stadium tour. At what point are bands going to no longer be able to play stadiums, or is that always going to be a thing? Will there always be a Pearl Jam? Will Jay-Z and Beyonce play Wrigley Field and sell out Wrigley Field for multiple nights? Is that always going to be something that happens, or is this something that's going to fade away? And I ask because there is something I love going to live club music. That's usually the music that I go to. I don't typically go to see big shows and big venues, but for bands like Pearl Jam, who I've seen 25-ish times live, I go to big venues, and there's something about going to see a show and the community experience you have with thousands, tens of thousands of other people who are singing along to songs that mean the world to you, and they clearly mean the world to them as well. And they happen at things like Bruce Springsteen and Pearl Jam, and I suppose U2. But I wonder if there's, other, are there other places where this is happening that I don't know about? And I guess, is this something that's going to continue on in the future? Are we always going to have stadium rock shows, or stadium music shows for that matter? And I guess, maybe it's happening in the electronic music, but I don't know if there's an electronic DJ that's able to sell out Wrigley Field or Safeco Field in Seattle, or whatever the stadium is in Boston. I just wonder if that's going to be continued to be a thing. So I'm looking forward to hearing back from you. Thanks for the second topic.